Hello, and welcome to another exciting edition of the Web of Conspiracy. I am your host, Adam Webb. It's great to be back with you again this week. Just a few announcements here before I start getting into some of the meat of the topic of the show, as well as some news items. Just wanted to thank everybody who's jumped in on the show all of a sudden. I mean, I had a huge spike, so I'm not sure how that happened, or how all this traffic was directed my way, but a huge spike in listenership over the last 2.5 weeks or so. So I just want to thank everybody for tuning in, as well as for all who continue to support the show and listen to the show on a regular basis. I want to thank you for your continued support. There have been times when I had considered if I didn't have anybody listening to the show, would I continue to do it? And those questions have been slowly erasing. Quite to my surprise, I've had more people listen than I really thought I would. So this is pretty cool. So I am excited, and it's really kind of hard to contain that excitement. I am really excited about the number of regular listeners. I think that's the key. I mean, I'm getting a lot of people who are coming and not just listening for one episode, but they're listening to several episodes. And I can see that in the fact that some of these older episodes that I did, starting back when I did the show in November, some of the older shows are getting listened to. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm gathering some people who are at least interested in some of the stuff I've done before as well. So once again, thank you to everybody who has jumped in on the show. It's very cool. I'm very excited about that. Couple other announcements. If you haven't had a chance, check out the social media for the show. Please do so. And I welcome as much feedback as possible in regards to the content of the show and really where the listeners stand on some of these topics. I think I've made very clear on most of these topics. I think it's very difficult to come up with definitive answers. Particularly if the answers do point to an unexplained or a paranormal solution. On those occasions where I believe that there is something concrete or there's something there, I certainly offer my opinion. But nevertheless, there's a number of these issues and these topics that I discussed that there just really isn't an easy answer for. So I really welcome everybody's opinions, including those who disagree with me. I welcome getting a little bit of that feedback as well. So for those of you who do continue, and there are a few of you particularly who are fairly regular contributors, I appreciate your feedback, and I do read it, even though I don't always get a chance to answer back to everybody. I certainly do take your feedback into consideration and try to answer back most of those comments that come across either through social media, website, email. So thank you for all of those who do support the show and provide feedback. Also, I realize that this is a little bit of a pain in the rear, but if you like the show, if you enjoy what I do, if you like the stuff I talk about, please give the show, rate the show either on iTunes if you download it through iTunes or through Stitcher. The more reviews I get, the more ratings that I get, the more publicity, so to speak, I get, the more they put me up into their feeds, and the greater chance that my show gets noticed by others. So I encourage all of you who, if you really love the show, to rate the show, review the show, so that way I can get more people to listen to the show. So if you have the time and feel so inclined, I would greatly appreciate it. Moving into the news topics for the show today. Now, there is one particular supernatural news item, and I really have kind of strayed away a little bit from doing a lot of supernatural news just because there's been a lot of other things in the I shouldn't say mainstream, but in other news that are also very important that I've been giving a lot of attention to. So I did want to touch on a topic that this is probably a couple weeks in the making. I watched this and I've debated feedback, and I thought, well, today's episode would be a great time to discuss it, and that is the documentary, so to speak, the Russian Yeti, The Killer Lives, that aired on the Discovery Channel. I think it was on June 1st in the States. I'm not sure internationally where that may have aired, but nevertheless, it was an interesting documentary. Now, I say documentary a little skeptically. To me, it looks more along the lines of one of those mockumentaries, much in the way that the Animal Planet's Mermaid documentary was, where this looks more like a movie meant to look like a documentary. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this or hadn't had a chance to see this, it is a documentation or some sort of replication of a documentation of the Dyatlov Pass incident, which, for those of you who haven't had a chance to listen to that podcast, please do so. I think it's one of the better. It's certainly one of the more popular. It's in my top 10 in terms of popularity here of the show for a number of listeners to it. It's a very popular topic. So if you haven't had a chance, listen to that podcast. That'll give you the entire breakdown of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Nevertheless, this documentary purports that the victims, the 9 who died at Dyatlov Pass, were victims of a Russian Yeti. Interesting theory. It's certainly one that I discussed in the Dyatlov Pass incident podcast. Nevertheless, I would like to get everyone else's feedback. If you have actually watched it, it feels very mockumentary to me, and that's a shame. To me, this is an intriguing story. There has been a lot of research done on this. I know that there are those who claim very concrete that there are very rational explanations, yet not all the pieces fit together well. So that is the reason why I think that there is so much speculation as to the fate of these people. Not everything is so clear-cut. There are those who say very definitively there was an avalanche and exposure, and that's why these events happened. And there are others who say, well, there's a number of other pieces of evidence that point to something else. And that being said, I encourage everybody who, if you're curious about this story, check out the Dyatlov Pass Incident podcast. I think it's one of my better ones. Certainly a very intriguing story. It's one that I have found intriguing for a long time now. So for those of you who've listened to that podcast and maybe if you've had a chance to check out this mockumentary, please do so. Let me know what you think. I'm curious. I'd love to get your feedback on this. I have a real issue with these mockumentary type things. I think it cheapens the story in a number of ways. And for those who actually do legitimate research on the topic, it cheapens it. There is a story here. The truth is not so clear cut. So to make so to speak, a mockumentary of this, mocking this incident, playing it as if though it is purely fiction, it's unfortunate. So that being said, I would love to get everyone's feedback on that who has had a chance to see it. Now, shifting into some more, traditional news topics. For those of you who've been listening to the show for a while, you know that I follow situations internationally. My day job, so to speak, is in policy analysis and particularly democracy. Now, I've been monitoring the situations in Iraq, in the Ukraine, certainly the Ukraine for a while now, as well as, of course, the recent situation in Iraq. Now, it's just starting to hit the mainstream, and I'm not sure that every mainstream outlet's going to cover this, so I'm making sure that I mention this here. The situation in Iraq has grown increasingly complicated. Last week, while the Sunni rebellion that was spearheaded by ISIS against the Shiite government in Iraq, the U.S.-supported Shiite government, while this rebellion was going on, this wasn't the only issue that was occurring in Iraq. The Kurds in an area of Iraq known as Kurdistan, in northeastern Iraq, have essentially expressed their independence and autonomy from the rest of Iraq. Though they haven't done it formally, they've taken Kirkuk, they've taken a number of key locations that are rich in oil. They've solidified their position. They've already had a degree of autonomy in Iraq. They're an interesting group in that many individuals in this area, while they identify themselves by religion, such as I'm a Sunni, a Sunni Muslim, Shia Muslim, these are individuals that don't, while they're primarily Shiite, they see themselves more as an ethnicity. So they see themselves as Kurds, and that's how they identify themselves. So that being said, they have essentially asserted their autonomy in the situation. While that's not entirely a bad thing per se, I'm not necessarily against this idea. It certainly complicates matters. And they're making every effort to protect themselves from ISIS. But it certainly complicates things, and certainly will have a degree. They have a degree of support. I think Iran and certainly Turkey will be very supportive of this autonomous state of Kurdistan. We will see where this goes, but nevertheless, it's something to keep an eye on. Now, the other situation going on in the world, Ukraine, this is not entirely unrelated to the situation in Iraq, and I will get into that here shortly. But the violence continues in the Ukraine, and NATO just reported yesterday that Russia is once again resuming military buildup along the border. Look, I know one individual had sent me this great link, and I think I'll probably go ahead and share this on the website. This great link to an individual speaking, I think it was at the Heritage Foundation, about the situation in the Ukraine with Russia and what Russia's looking to do. And this is the key that everybody has to remember about the Ukraine, for those who are interested. The Ukraine didn't exist as the Ukraine for a number of years, very similar to Poland. Okay, there really wasn't a Poland for most of history. There was no Poland, just as there was no Ukraine for most of history. Russia perceives the Ukraine as a made-up nation, that this isn't really real, that really they're just rebellious Russians, that these are really truly, this is Russian area. As a matter of fact, if you go back to the imperial days, this area was often referred to as New Russia, which has a lot to do with the policies that are occurring today. The Putin and the Russians today, they speak of this Novorussia. It literally translates into a new Russia. That is the goal here. That is the plan. That is the desire, to rebuild Russia. I had a chance to yesterday speak to an individual who had just gotten back from Europe, who had been touring throughout Europe, meeting with a number of leaders there. This is not a great situation. It is very much on the brink of escalating. Now, here's the kicker. ISIS, who I discussed earlier in Iraq. Al-Qaeda supported ISIS. They have been quite the thorn in the side in many international dealings, particularly this region of the world. They are also responsible for the conflict in Syria. Syria, of course, being allied with Russia. Now we have ISIS going to war, essentially creating a civil war in Iraq. In one climate, the United States and President Obama supports ISIS. That would be in Syria. In another climate, they don't, in Iraq. The United States is going to have to consolidate and come to terms with this particular group. Obama cannot afford to support ISIS in Syria anymore. Okay? He's going to have to withdraw support for ISIS. Doesn't have a choice now. He's backed into a wall. The interesting thing is that, of course, earlier, last week when this all began to erupt, there was not going to be any boots in the ground. Well, now we've got 300 troops coming to serve as military advisors and to protect citizens in Iraq. I'd be amazed if we don't see a further escalation. But nevertheless, who knows? I'm not going to pretend that I've been able to understand everything that President Obama's foreign policy has dictated. Nevertheless, we now have a situation where a Russian-backed Syria can really leverage the United States here. All of this being so interconnected, and I'm not one to try to instill fear. There are a number of other hosts and who talk about conspiracies, and a number of other hosts that will talk about how horrible things are. And yes, things aren't great. That being said, I believe there's always hope. So, to be honest with you, when I see the situation occurring here, I'm very concerned about a large-scale global conflict. I'm hesitant to say a world war, but when you look at the interconnectedness of these pieces, it's hard to imagine that there not being some sort of potential global issue. The United States is going to have to swing its policy on ISIS. It's going to have to support Syria. It's going to have to support the established Syrian government going forward. It is not going to be able to continue to support the rebel forces there. It does not have a choice. Otherwise, we abandon Iraq. And I don't see us abandoning Iraq. Obviously, I believe that we're going to escalate in Iraq. Because we cannot afford in the international community to have done everything we did in Iraq for a number of years, only to abandon it when civil war erupts. Particularly an Al-Qaeda-backed civil war. And it still floors me in many respects that we supported Al-Qaeda in Syria. Nevertheless, I've not been a big fan of the Syrian government there either, to be clear. However, it's the idea of these autonomous states, right? It's the same situation with the Ukraine. We have Russia threatening the sovereignty of the Ukraine, and the international community goes up in arms. When there is a threat to the sovereignty in Syria, well, perhaps they use chemical weapons, so is it really such a bad thing if we support a rebellion there, even though it's being spearheaded by Al-Qaeda? Well, obviously, it's proven to be a problem. We have to begin at some point, as an international community, to respect the sovereignty of other nations. We're moving to an age of coalition governments. We're moving to an age of regional governance at this point. And I know a number of people are scared of that. A number of people are scared of the New World Order kind of thing. And while there's some legitimate concerns there, that is the direction we're moving in this interconnected world that we now live in. So at some point, we have to begin to respect these other boundaries before we can start building new alliances. So the United States doesn't have a choice. They have to withdraw support for ISIS. We'll see how this goes moving forward. But nevertheless, this is all very interconnected, and this is something to keep an eye on going forward. Now, before I move in to the main topic of the show, there is something I want to address. I would love to get some feedback from the audience about the nature of the show. I typically have been structuring this as of late where I do a lot of these news topics and talk about the government, and I talk about international affairs, and I talk about all these things, and sometimes, and many times, there's some conspiracy related material there. However, it's not always related. And I'd really love to get some feedback. I'm actually contemplating doing two shows. Doing a show, and whether or not I would produce it on another podcast feed and just create a separate show, or if I would do just two shows a week, one dedicated strictly to conspiracy and the unknown and the supernatural and the paranormal, and one dedicated to world politics and world events. I'd love to get some feedback from listeners as to whether or not you like that idea, or if you enjoy the mix that I've been putting together. I try to balance this as best I can. However, there are sometimes I think, I'd like to go a little bit more in detail with this and maybe just do an episode about this. But nevertheless, I would love to get some feedback from the audience about whether or not you feel I should do separate shows for these topics. So let me know. Hit me up on an email, webofconspiracy2bs@gmail.com, or through Facebook, Twitter, Google+. Let me know. I really, this is important. I would love to get some feedback from listeners, particularly those who've been listening for a while, as to whether or not you like the idea of me doing two shows a week, one specifically towards politics and government and international affairs, and then another towards conspiracies and the unknown and the paranormal. So let me know. Okay, I would greatly appreciate that. Now, trying to transition today's topic's a little different, a little difficult. But this has been a legendary creature that I had heard about, I think maybe the first time, maybe about 10 years ago. And I've always sort of found it interesting and fascinating for a number of reasons that I'll get into shortly. But the Wendigo, and for those of you who aren't familiar with what it's sometimes pronounced Wendigo, it just depends on how you want to anglicize it. It's a Native American name. Now, the Wendigo is part of this North American Indian lore. It is a legend spoken of as a great deal throughout Canada and the northern parts of the United States. Minnesota, there's a strong following to the idea of the Wendigo in these northern tier states, and then, of course, into Canada. I know it's very popular in Ontario. So this is an interesting creature. Now, to be specific, it is a cannibalistic ghoul-like creature, as one person has described it. Native American tribes have claimed that they roam the forests, eating humans and devouring human flesh. That's their drive and their goal. And in terms of the way this creature looks, there's a number of descriptions about it, and some of it is varied. However, it is claimed to be very tall. That is the one distinguishing feature. Many people argue about 15 feet tall, which would be huge. Okay, there are those who claim it's very white in color, some that say it's yellow in color. The colors have varied a bit on that. But one other interesting facet, there are many who claim that there is a star in the middle of the forehead of these creatures. Now, they supposedly have very sharp, long claws and teeth, okay, which, of course, they use to attack. And they're incredibly strong. They move fast. They have these huge strides, being 15 feet tall, but they're very stealthy. They move quietly. There are legends that claim that they use trees as snowshoes, okay? Some other intriguing legends that are associated with the idea of this Wendigo is that many argue that where the Wendigo, blizzards often follow, as if though they're bringing in this cold, this snow, and this supernatural force with them. And there are others who claim that animals don't follow fairly closely to the Wendigo, because particularly predatory animals, because they look for the scraps that are left behind by the beast. So wolves will often be accompanied, and they will feed on the leftover human parts that the Wendigo has not consumed or taken as trophies. They are often described as, once they rip out the internal organs of their victims, they then take the skull and will use the skull for a trophy, to play with it. Kind of very twisted type of a scenario there. Now, another identifying feature is that they're often described as having these terrifying screams, these shrilling screams that pierce the night. Okay, very terrifying screams associated with this creature, and that's not from the victims, but rather the creature itself. Now, the Cree tribe, and this is a Native American tribe, the Cree, they believe that the Wendigo was once a human who had become possessed by a cannibal, and they'd become possessed either through a bite, either willingly sacrificing themselves to a Wendigo, hoping to become one, or against their will by being attacked by a Wendigo. They also believe that a human can become a Wendigo through a curse, a magical type of curse, or in a dream state. If a Wendigo appears to you in a dream, you could become a Wendigo. So, kind of a creepy kind of scenario there, either through attacking or even in your dreams. This Wendigo has this kind of power. Now, some of the earliest sightings that have been attributed to the Wendigo, at least believed to be the Wendigo, date back to the 1600s when Jesuit missionaries moved into Canada, and they claimed to see these creatures. They would describe them very similarly to the native tribes did, as the native tribes did. And there were further claims described in the 1700s by white settlers who moved into the area, what is now Minnesota. Okay? And they believed that these Wendigo were omens of death. These Wendigo would appear near the villages, surroundings, and then shortly thereafter, people would die, go missing, and many believed that perhaps they were just death omens. There were others who believed that these Wendigo were responsible. Okay. Now, it's another intriguing theories about this. As I'd mentioned before, the Cree believed that the Wendigo was formed by a possession, so to speak. Okay? This cannibalistic type of entity of some sort possessing humans. Now, this possession, they claim, it can be stopped by a shaman, okay, a Native American shaman who uses certain spiritual rites and rituals can prevent the possession, okay? However, the more common method is that you just kill the creature, that possession, but usually by the time that the person is possessed, it's almost too late. Now, the creature, at least according to lore, can be killed in a few different ways. Well, it's you have to cut the body into pieces and burn it. That's one story. There's another story saying that you have to cut into pieces, you have to pierce the heart. Okay? All this being done preferably with either a silver blade, a silver knife, or silver bullets, which are all very effective according to lore. But that you have to pierce the heart and then separate the pieces of the heart and bury the pieces of the heart in separate locations. Because if you don't do this, it has the power to resurrect itself. Okay, so that's why you see in many cases there are very specific rituals on how you're supposed to get rid of these Wendigo. A traditional death will not work. They have too much magical power associated with them that a simple beheading will not be enough. You have to burn, or you have to separate the parts and bury, okay? Now, there's a couple of intriguing stories that go along with the Wendigo realm, and these, of course, also go back to the Cree-Indians. Now, the Algonquin Indian tribes also spoke. The Ojibwa, which I believe is how you pronounce it, is another tribe that spoke of. This legend existed in a number of Native tribes, Native American tribes, particularly through this time period, going into the late 19th century. Now, to give you an example, one of the more gruesome stories of a purported Wendigo was a Cree trapper named Swift Runner. Now, he was hanged at Fort Saskatchewan in Alberta, Canada. I believe it was in 1879. Now, he was hanged because, according to reports, the winter before, he had murdered and then proceeded to eat 8 family members, including his wife, his brother. Pretty brutal scene. I think he shot one, he killed others with an axe. Really brutal situation. And I guess one boy child, before he killed and ate that child, forced the child to eat human flesh before killing the child ultimately. So really kind of a really twisted scenario. Now, there are many who argue and discuss what they call this Wendigo psychosis, where people would become cannibals, take on cannibalistic, kind of just lose their minds, a mental illness, so to speak, okay? And it was the idea of the Wendigo, and this occurring was a common fear in these communities in the late 19th century. Many native tribes talked about it. The white settlers living in the area talked about it. It was a huge concern for people in this time period. They believed that this was very real. Now, to give you an example, this once again is another lore connected to the Cree Native Americans. A Cree named Jack Fiddler deemed himself a Wendigo hunter. That was what he did. And he claimed that he had killed 14 Wendigo in his lifetime. Now, ultimately, he was imprisoned after the last killing. which occurred in October of 1907. The last Wendigo that he killed. He was 87 years old at the time that he was imprisoned, and he claimed that they were having to do this because they could not save this woman. I believe it was a woman who was possessed, and him and his son were both tried for her murder, and they were both convicted. His son was assisting him in trying to get rid of this through a shamanistic ritual, as I had mentioned earlier, and ultimately they were forced to kill this woman because there was no saving her. It was too late. Now, naturally, the court system believed otherwise, that this was an issue, and he was ultimately imprisoned for doing this. Now, 14, he claimed to have killed 14 Wendigo. Now, hopefully those were all, in fact, Wendigo. Otherwise, he killed 14 people who were dealing with perhaps mental illnesses or some other issues. Nevertheless, it's kind of a creepy story, right? I mean, looking at the legend of the Wendigo, what are we really looking at here? Many who would take a traditional explanation would say, well, look, what we're really dealing with here are psychotic cannibals and people living in fear and creating this entity that doesn't exist, that they're explaining it away through supernatural means, when in fact this is just a horrible mental illness that these people are suffering from. Now, when doing this story, while researching more into the Wendigo, it reminded me of a show that I had done almost a year ago to the day. On the old show that I did, I had a show about zombies, and I eventually at some point will probably get back to zombies again. But I did a show about zombies, and there were two particular stories that occurred. One in Florida where a man began to attack another man and just eat his face, began eating his face. There was another story of a man who, while riding a bus, attacked another man and cut his head off and began eating the flesh. And I couldn't help but, as I was reading this, but to think of the Wendigo. Maybe there is some sort of Wendigo psychosis, that this is just people just completely losing their minds and this happening. However, one other school of thought here is that this is in fact some sort of demonic possessed human, but this spirit, this entity, possesses these individuals. Now, while I have not done a show specifically on demonic possession, I do intend to do so here in the near future. Nevertheless, the idea that is very prominent in these communities, that these were regular humans, that suddenly something snapped. They weren't themselves. They began to crave human flesh. They behaved strangely. They claimed they were plagued in their dreams by this demonic force that they described as a Wendigo. Now, what if in fact this is some sort of demonic entity that's manifesting in this way? I don't know. But it's certainly an intriguing possibility for those who believe that this is a supernatural event, that this is something beyond the norm, or at least unexplained. And the lore on this is pretty extensive. And I think for many of you who know my background prior to what I do now, I also was a historian. And I can't help but when I look at hundreds of years of reports, hundreds of years of lore, and I realize that yes, our knowledge has changed and advanced, and we can explain things before that couldn't be explained in rational means. But what I do know is this. People, even though they're not always 100% reliable in what they see, these legends and these lore that develop, there's an element of truth in it. The key is finding what the truth is. Where is the truth? Just how unusual is the truth? That is the challenge, I think, in any sort of paranormal or unexplained creature entity event. It's finding the truth that's in the core of it. And just how out there is that truth? Is it a rational explanation, or is it something that goes beyond what our traditional rational minds would have us believe? Okay? This is a situation that makes me wonder that perhaps there is something greater than a natural explanation here. That perhaps there is something greater going on here. And it's just because of the number of different native tribes that carried this legend. And that where it seems to be centrally located, it seems to be a certain area of the world that seems to feed this Wendigo legend. Now, perhaps there is some sort of demonic possession angle to this. It could be. I can't say for certain. Nevertheless, there is another possibility. And it ties into the area and the location and the description of the creature in many ways. What if perhaps the Wendigo is a Sasquatch? What if it's a Bigfoot, a Yeti, one of these, purported hominids that many people who have claimed to have seen, that I believe I had seen on one occasion? What if the Sasquatch is the explanation here? When we're discussing the area, right? Northern tier of the United States, into Canada, mountainous areas of Canada, heavily forested regions of Canada in the United States. Perhaps these very tall creatures, very strong, move silent, perhaps what is being described here is some sort of Sasquatch. In the actual description of the entity seen. Now, the people that claim to be possessed by a Wendigo, well, then that's a little different story. But for those who claim to have seen the Wendigo, well, maybe the Sasquatch is the explanation here. It's difficult to say. I don't know. I would love to talk to those who believe that they've actually seen a Wendigo, an actual credible witness. If you go online and you try to look for sightings of Wendigo, it's all these YouTube videos look incredibly faked and staged, and it's horrible. So in terms of reliable evidence that there is a Wendigo, it's pretty weak and it's pretty unreliable. But the idea that perhaps this is just a misidentification to another legend that is fairly well documented at this point, to me, that feels like a perhaps greater possibility. That really what we're looking at with the Wendigo is some sort of primate, hominid type of missing link, the Gigantopithecus that is often attributed to this ancient ape that was very tall, purportedly up to 15 feet tall, mind you. We have this native lore, and of course these natives who lived in these areas would have shared the land with these entities and have many discussions and descriptions of beings that match the Sasquatch, these wild men, these hairy men that live in the mountains. So perhaps what we're really dealing with here with some of these other Native American tribes is that they're calling it a Wendigo, but what if in fact it is actually a Sasquatch? To me, that seems to be the explanation. That is what I believe. From what I've read, I would make the assumption that if the Wendigo is real, then it was most likely a Sasquatch. Now, I'm not dismissing the Wendigo psychosis, but then again, there could be a number of reasons for that. Many of those natural. Perhaps there could be a possession-type entity thing going on here. I'm not willing to completely dismiss that, but based on the evidence, based on the legends, the lore, I would tend to believe and associate that this is probably a misidentification of what other tribes refer to as a Sasquatch. So, well, that's what I have for you today. I'd love to get your feedback on the Wendigo. Let me know. Email, social media, any of those areas. Let me know. This is an interesting story, and as I said, you know where I stand on this. This is one of those occasions where I'm fairly willing to take a pretty hard stance on what I believe is actually happening here. But let me know what you think, and if you disagree, let me know. I'd love to get feedback and would love to know where you stand on the Wendigo. So, just a reminder, check out all the social media. Give me feedback on the show. Let me know the direction, what you like, what you don't like. Love to get all that feedback. So, for today, that's all I've got for you. Next week, I got a pretty cool show lined up. I'll give you more details forthcoming. But I'll be back with you again next week. Have a great week.